Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It is Thursday, September 8th, 2016. The reason why I wanted to do this webinar is because so often we have recommendations for parents and sometimes for even our clients, our young people, to go to 12-step programs. And so often I hear from people that the 12 steps don't apply to them, that the 12 steps aren't something that they need. So what I wanted to talk about, what were the underlying principles of the 12 step and what I think is just a healthy way to live. And I think I want to debunk some of the myths and ideas that people think about 12 steps when they hear about them from other people, because I think there's some misconceptions about why or how it doesn't work. I really do think that 12 steps are really just fundamental to healthy living in life. And so whether you're an addict or not, whether you're the family member of an addict or not, whether you're the family member, like many of you, of a child who struggles in another way besides alcohol or drugs, I think there's wonderful application in our lives. So I want to talk about that. So I'm going to go through the 12 steps, and then I'm going to talk about some of the general ideas around the 12 steps, but I want to go through each one of them. The first of the 12 steps says we admitted to ourselves that we are powerless over alcohol. You can put in there other people, you can put in there drugs, you can put on there sex, you can put in there your child, but essentially it's an idea that you're powerless. And I think that's where a lot of parents get to by the time they send their child to Evoke. We are powerless over the other thing, that our lives have become unmanageable. I think the core principle here is there's a surrender. And surrender isn't giving up. Surrender is stop trying to control something that is uncontrollable. Stop trying to control the other person, which you really can't control. Stop trying to control drug abuse because for you it doesn't work. Because drug use for you is something that gets unmanageable very quickly. Right? You can't have one drink. For those of us that are parents, I can't be in charge of my child's grades. Right? I can't be the one to monitor them. I have to let go. I have to turn that over to my spouse, to somebody else, even to my child in the end. So it's just a recognition of letting go of the thing that you can't control. That's what it's about. And in a way, it's very empowering. That's also a misunderstanding of the 12 steps is if I stop trying to control things that I can't control, if I recognize that I can't manage that which is unmanageable, then what I can focus on is what I can control. And so I think an implied piece of this is being able to focus on or redirecting my focus to something that I can. It's not a weakness, it's not a lack of accountability, and it's not an abdication. And I think a lot of people hear that. I think it's a recognition of our own fallibility, our own limitations. All of us have struggles and challenges. All of us have susceptibilities, an Achilles heel. We're all predisposed in some ways to certain things. Nobody's perfect. And so to be able to recognize that the person who is diabetic recognizes that they have to be vigilant in a different way than somebody who doesn't have diabetes. The alcoholic who has the predisposition for alcoholism can't treat alcohol the way that somebody who doesn't have that predisposition is, right? And you have personality characteristics, all of us do, that weaknesses, holes, limitations that if we pay attention to them, it really does prescribe a certain kind of way of living. That's what this first step does. If I acknowledge this, then there's things that I can manage. I can manage my sugar intake if I'm a diabetic. I'm not a diabetic, but one thing I often do, and in fact, I rarely even have a sweet or a dessert, and people ask me why, because it's not like I eat perfectly, but I say it's my drug of choice. I can't have one M&M. I just don't do well with that. So I can't take a handful of M&Ms, or else I'm going to want to eat the entire bag or the entire bowl. So it asks or suggests a certain kind of vigilance, a certain kind of course of action for us. That's what this first step also does. I had a student years ago, Jimmy, and I remember after reading his impact letter, we were sitting down, he was very upset. He'd heard about aftercare, he'd heard about the big picture that his parents had set up for him in the letter, in the impact letter. And he said to me through tears, he said, "You've taken away all of my freedom except for my choices." And I thought that was a profound moment. I said, "Say that again, Jimmy. Say what you just said." And he said, "You've taken away all of my freedom except for my choices." And I think that what that speaks to is this idea that freedom really does come down to, in the end, what we can choose to do. We can't choose the parents we were born into. We can't choose the genes. We can't choose our diabetic predisposition, right? But we can choose how we deal with sugar. We can deal with whether or not we drink. We can deal whether or not we go to a meeting. We can deal, if we have trauma in our lives, to go to therapy, to go to a Codependence Anonymous meeting, to go to an Al-Anon meeting, to listen to mentors and get a sponsor. We can control those things. I think wilderness therapy does so well to emphasize this powerlessness because out there, you're absolutely not in control. And it's obvious. You're not in control of the wind, the rain, the snow, the heat, the bugs. And so it asks, again, just by the milieu, just by the intervention, it asks us to recognize what we're in control of and what we're not in control of. I remember when I was visiting my son in the wilderness, I'd kind of, at this point in my career, had become well practiced at letting go of control when I was the therapist. And I remember we were in a torrential downpour for hours and hours and hours with my son, and I kept thinking, this is ruining my visit with my son. And I remember thinking that and catching myself really quick and saying, gosh, as a therapist, I've recognized the value of being in a situation you were powerless and what it could teach you. And yet when I was a parent outside of that role, in a different role, I quickly reverted to this idea that I was limited or hampered to a great extent by simply something as difficult or simple as the rain. So we learn what's out of our control. We learn what our locus of control. External locus of control means that what happens to me determines my happiness. Internal locus of control means how I respond to it determines my happiness. I remember studying sports psychology, and they were talking about successful athletes had a higher internal locus of control, lower external locus of control. If they had a bad game, for example, at the plate, at bat in baseball, they didn't attribute it to the pitcher being great. They attributed it to them getting out of practice. So what did they do? They worked harder on their craft, their practice. Learning that you can't manipulate other things. Peers outside of your control, of course, the staff, the therapists. Ultimately, as we work with you, the parents, you become much less susceptible. Some of that is facilitated through the distance you have with your child, through the slowness of the letter writing process where we begin. But eventually, some of your awareness, some of your clarity, some of your groundedness, some of your refocus on making your life a project get you to focus on your response to your child rather than what they're doing. So that's the first step. Those are some of the core principles in that. The second step, come to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. This is probably one of the most common stumbling blocks for parents and for young people. They think they have to be somewhere near a traditional understanding of God and traditional religions, organized religions, and it's much, much broader than that. Ultimately, it's just saying, I need help. I need a group to help me. I need others to help me. I can't do this on my own. In wilderness therapy, we do that by creating space for meditation, mindfulness, introspection, right? We quiet things down. Wilderness can, for some people, nature can, for some people, be that higher power. Learning to trust staff, learning to surrender control. Maybe, I love it when clients and students say, I'm not sure I know what's best for me at this point. My best thinking got me here. So I'm beginning to trust the staff, my therapist, my parents in this process. Sometimes people talk about higher power in AA as G period, O period, D period, a group of drunks. The group becomes, my attendance at AA becomes my higher power, becomes something that I can rely on. Sometimes my therapist becomes my higher power in that way. But the fact of the matter is, it's just this reorientation that I need help, that I can be teachable, that somebody I can get and gain strength, somebody can offer me their strength. I always think about how one of the ways that wilderness facilitates this is that the experience that they're beginning to have, the benefits they begin to taste from this intervention, they start to come to this idea in this second step. Like, this worked. I didn't like it. I didn't want it. I fought it. I thought I could do it on my own. I resisted it. And now I'm starting to see the benefits of it. I think solos and the noble silence, it's called, of wilderness and the quietude of wilderness can offer the ability to get in touch with something greater in yourself. And it can be very fundamentally spiritual, and it can be very modern. You can have a lot of substitutes. In my own life, I substitute faith and trust for radical acceptance, right? I believe that my higher power is still there, exists, and that what is happening to me is not something that shouldn't be happening to me, for example. And when I'm in that space, I can trust that process. And then I can get the wisdom, the gifts that it has to offer. When I fight against that, when I think it should be happening another way, when I think that I'm God, that I'm in control, that I can manage everything, then of course I'm not going to see the wisdom, see the treasure, see the silver lining in the thing, the difficult, the challenge that's happening at that moment. Sometimes the natural beauty can be inspirational. For some people, that's evidence of God. For some people, like I said, that becomes a kind of a God for them. I think transcendence, being able to transcend, I think this is a large part of the 12 steps. Transcendence is this idea in spirituality where I can overcome what is. I can overcome it by thinking about it a different way. That again, it's like that locus of control, that it doesn't determine me, right? All that I am, all that I've been given, all that's happened to me isn't going to define me. That's a transcendence. The trauma, the abuse that I've experienced, I can transcend that. And that can be for many people equal to spirituality. Nature's power, I've discussed that. And this faith and fear idea, right? Most of us get stuck in trying to control things, trying to manage things so we won't get hurt. Instead of learning to go with the flow. That doesn't mean you become passive. You don't do nothing. The simplest example that I can give of this example of trusting and letting go and how it doesn't equal passivity is telling the truth. If I'm willing to tell you the truth in a relationship, if I'm willing to be honest with you, I'm letting go of control. If I exaggerate, minimize, kind of blur the truth, or just outright tell you a lie, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to control how you feel and how you react. So the honest person has let go of control. The dishonest person is trying to control. And that's how letting go in this process is equivalent to being more active, more assertive, more authentic. The third step, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Again, there's that trust, there's that acceptance, there's that going with it, learning from it, learning to act within what is happening. And that means there's going to be difficult decisions. I might have to leave my alcoholic spouse. I might have to say to my abusive, reactive, bipolar daughter that she can't come home. I might have to make the tough decisions like that because I don't want that abuse. And then I'm going to trust when I live in my truth, when I live authentically, when I express it, making all the effort I can to be as wise, as enlightened, as loving and compassionate as I can, then I trust that the right thing will happen, that it'll be okay, right? That's that shift from being God to trusting God as you understand Him or it or her. Learning to trust staff and authority is that change that I talked about that we start to see. It starts to become evidence, if you will, of a child, a young adult making this shift from I can control and manage everything to I'm going to begin to trust. I talk about this out in the field. I think what wellness therapy can do, and even what therapy can do in generally, when you send your child to therapy, wellness therapy does, well, is I talk about with the clients and the students, I'm not God. I'm not playing the role of God in your life. I'm playing the role of Isaac Newton. You know, what this program does, what everything that's happening here does, is it doesn't invent anything. It doesn't create the truth. It just shows you how it works. I didn't invent gravity. I'm just showing you how it works. Showing you the way that I think the universe works. And it takes parents and individuation out of the equation, meaning that they're not fighting against you anymore. They're fighting against life, right? They're battling the laws of nature and life and what is, instead of what they think is your contrived, crazy, distorted idea of life. I say to the students, most of you are in my generation and remember the television series Bewitched. And I remember when I was a young kid, I remember watching it. I remember wishing that in every episode, I wish, why doesn't Darren, the husband, just want his wife to use magic all the time? Right? Why doesn't, if I was, as a kid, I was like, if I was him, I'd be like, yeah, get us all the money we want, all the things that we want, I'll make all the pain go away, all of that, make it all go away with the magic that you have. And of course, at the end of every episode, they both concluded every time, we're not going to use magic anymore. And why did they decide that? And the reason they decided that is because the struggle is worth it. The pain teaches us. The difficulty is an important and valuable part of life. And what I say to the clients that I work with, in some ways, substance abuse issues or any kind of medicator, cutting on yourself, right? Any way that you're self-destructive to prevent yourself from feeling is kind of like using magic not to feel it. And we all do that, more or less. And sometimes it gets a hold of us, like in the case of somebody who's addicted or has a mental health disorder, an anxiety disorder, a depressive disorder, and so on. And so we learn in this process to feel, we learn to trust, we learn to go with it. And then we heal and we grow and we stretch ourselves and we transform. And we learn to find the meaning in our suffering. I remember one time I was watching this documentary on concussion syndrome. Now it's fairly dated, but at the time it was cutting edge. And there was this young man who got a concussion in football, high school football. And then he still had symptoms and he lied to his coach about it, lied to his coach and his parents about it. And then he went back in the game and there's this situation with secondary concussions where he got a relatively average hit and he died. And it showed his father was videotaping him and it showed him collapsing on the field and they later found out that he died. And I remember thinking, and I say this to the clients all the time, why do you think he didn't tell the truth? Why didn't he tell the truth to his coaches and his parents and everybody? And everybody knows the answer, because if he would have told the truth, they wouldn't have let him play. Right? And so sometimes in therapy, I was just talking to a parent today, the way that your children frame this is like they're getting in trouble. They're not getting in trouble. Yes, if you tell us and you that you were using crack cocaine and we didn't know that, we might have a different treatment plan. Yes, if you were lying about a lot of things, if you were more severe than we were aware of. Yes, with that new information, we're going to have more energy around a certain kind of intervention. Absolutely. But you're not in trouble. Just like if that young man had told his coach, hey, coach, I'm still having headaches and blurred vision. And the coach said, well, I'm going to sit you out the next game then. You're not in trouble. He's protecting you from the possibility, in this case, of dying. And the possibility of your children of dying or less than that, but still dangerously harming your life. So it changes the paradigm. And I want you all, when you're talking to your children, to have it in your mind that when they're talking about feeling sorry, and I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm making it up, I'm doing bad. It's not about getting better in the sense that you're doing right now. It's about healing. It's about getting healthier. And yes, there are going to be boundaries around that for me. This third step is that you don't know everything and you're not in control of everything. Just like we talk about all the time on these webinars, the only thing that you can grasp, and this is a lifelong challenge, is your truth and the expression of that. But you can't know your child's truth, and you can't push all the right, you can't be responsible for pushing all the right buttons. And that kind of beginner's mind, that kind of humility, that kind of openness, that kind of willingness to be interdependent and to trust and to focus on expressing your truth and not trying to manage everything is a principle underneath this third step. Made a fearless, searching and fearless more inventory of ourselves. This is step 4. I think in our program it's a lot like the life story or the letter of accountability. You know, I would often have most of my students write 3 or 4 versions of the letter of accountability. I've had students write as many as 10 or 12. It's more of a process, right? The letter is an outcome, right? It's something that is produced in this process. But I'm really doing it to teach them about accountability. It's not an apology. It's not a promise that you'll never do it again. It's an awareness. It's an ownership. It's seeing the relationship between what you were doing and what was happening. Not blaming or justifying, but seeing that relationship and being responsible for it. Seeing potentially the consequences. So there are so many parts of that I use to teach, that we use to teach your children. But it's not just necessarily the outcome. And in our program, we also do a war story, which is to talk about things that you were doing that were inappropriate, but that you were getting something out of, right? I was getting high and I loved it. I was yelling at my parents and it made me feel powerful. I was quitting school and it made me feel safe because I was too anxious. You start to talk about what you were doing and what you were getting out of it. But more than anything, in steps 4, and I'll go on to 5, we're starting to address the guilt and the shame. What are they hiding? That's really the barrier to writing a good moral inventory, to writing a good life story letter of accountability. It's not only that you'll get in trouble if you're honest, that's a part of it. But mostly, fundamentally, it's the shame. It's if I have to look at who I really am and all of my flaws, limitations, and warts, then I'm not lovable, I'm not likable. So steps 4 and 5 begin to address what is really at the core of most addictive behaviors and most of the troubles that we all struggle with in therapy, pre-therapy, the problems that lead us to therapy. In the 12-step program, you share that story with somebody else, at least one other person. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human the exact nature of our wrong. I read this inventory to somebody else. In AA or Codependence Anonymous or Families Anonymous, it might be a sponsor. It could be your therapist, right? Somebody like that. Some people do it to their priest or their bishop or their rabbi. Our stance in Religion on God is that we encourage you to consider the religion of your family of origin. We consider we don't advocate for any one religion. We don't even advocate for a belief in God. We just ask you to look at it, to consider. And if you're going to reject it based on some kind of core belief system, not on trying to define yourself as separate from your parents. It's a lot like the 12 step. If you're going to reject it, why are you rejecting it? What's going on there? So we encourage spirituality. We're open to it. We allow you to celebrate. We'll allow you to have your own religious texts, to celebrate your religious holidays, to even, the group in December, for example, gets to have 2 or 3 different holidays because we encourage everybody to share it and to celebrate. Sometime with regard to the letter of accountability, we will send it home. Sometimes we won't. Some young adults don't want to send it home. Some young adults, if they're going to write a really searching and fearless moral inventory, they're not ready to share it with their parents, and that can be okay. So it's not always something that you get to read all of it. Sometimes it is. The power of disclosing it to others. I think more than anything is the disclosing of to others and having that other person not reject you and not be repulsed by you. That's the value. Having an experience where you talk about all the things that you've done and somebody sits and says, yeah, that's you. You did that. You're still welcome here. I'm not going to judge you or reject you based on that. And you've been carrying around a lot of pain. It's getting out of your secrets. In the 12-step programs, they talk about only being as sick as your secrets. Sometimes when the parents do get it and how they react to it is an important part of the process, right? I remember when my son wrote his letter of accountability to me, he told me at the very end, I don't want you to be upset. I don't want you to hold this against me. And he gave me a list of things he didn't want me to do. And basically I wrote back and I said, I get to react how I want. I know that you're scared. It took a lot of courage, but you can't manage how I might be hurt. I might be angry. I might share this with somebody in the neighborhood who was involved in it. It's mine now. And accountability includes a willingness to let go of how the other person is going to react to it. But at the core, learning to see yourself, practicing seeing yourself, being honest with yourself, being seen by somebody else, honestly, without judgment, is a fundamental part of this step 5. And like I talk about in my book, the contribution of shame and guilt to our lives is cancerous, emotionally and spiritually. It is not the solution. It does not lead to good acts. It does not lead to healthy living. It leads to hiding, denial, repression, justification, defensiveness, dishonesty. It leads to all of those things. Once in a while, shame and guilt can look like morality, but it is not that. I've said this as many times as I've said anything. Most parents, even when I say to them, you knew the right thing, but you didn't do it, why? And their response is, I felt guilty. I felt guilty that he would be upset or he would be hurt or sad or whatever. So guilt in that instance is telling them to do the wrong thing. If guilt and shame cannot be relied on to tell us the truth, then we've got to throw them out. We've got to find some other motivation. And what I propose is love, and what I propose is something like the 12 steps or therapy that teaches us a greater awareness of ourselves instead of to hide when we make mistakes. I put steps 6 and 7 and I believe 8 and 9 together. We were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. It's, again, more of that letting go, just putting it out there and saying, I'm going to say I'm sorry later on when we get to the steps. I'm going to make amends where I can. And then I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm going to practice the practice of letting go. And it's a process, right? It's a practice. It's not something you do. It's not an intellectual exercise. I say for parents, one of the things, the best things you can do is learn to get rid of your guilt. Your guilt, letting go of your guilt will have a fantastic effect on your parenting, and will more likely create a parenting dynamic where you're contributing to your child's self-esteem, accountability, willingness to feel, and so on and so forth. So when we can let go of our mistake, and I can't tell you, and I do this in an ironic way. That's why I talk about being an idiot parent, right? Recognizing you screwed up your kids. Because when I have parents that are beating themselves up week after week, month after month that I work with, my response to them is say, let's just assume you did screw up your kids. What are you going to do? Should we beat you for it? Should we put you in prison for life? Right? Or can we use what you've learned from your mistakes going forward and try to do better tomorrow? And then after you fall again, try to do better the next day. So there's just a process of moving on. And I think a lot of people hold on to their guilt and their shame like a blanket, like it comforts them. Like if they feel it, they're better people for feeling it. Instead of saying, I can look at my fallibility. I can realize, this is Brad talking now. I can recognize I absolutely, in all of my children's cases, this is not hypothetical, I can recognize that in many ways I've screwed them up. Without judgment, without guilt, without beating myself up. And then I can say, and I can do better tomorrow, and I'll try. And I did it because of my wounds, my limitations, my humanness. It's not abdication. It's not ignoring it. It's not being responsible and being unaccountable. It's just getting through it, moving past it, transcending. I find that when parents can say that phrase without judgment, I realize I screw up my kids all the time. I make mistakes all the time. Then they're okay. Then their children can be in relationship with them. Then their children can be mad at them and it can be okay. They can be empathic. They can say they're sorry. They can work on something because they know they have faults. So a lot of this, again, is about shame, about looking at ourselves and being honest, humility, surrender. I remember I had a client one time, and when we were talking about surrender, because that's one of the concepts throughout the 12 steps and concept in the 12-step meeting, he said, I want to change the word surrender. And I said, I can't think of anything more ironic. That you actually believe in the principle, but for you have to change the word surrender. Because you don't like it. You don't like the connotation of it. That seems to me to be a good example of not surrendering. I think for the clients, part of this process is realizing that the change is slow. They're going to make some progress here, but this change takes a long time. What we really want is we want to get your children to wake up, to see that they need help, to see that they need this work. It could be a 12-step program. It could be therapy. To see that you all need as parents. We just want to get you started. We're not going to finish anything here. And what we're hoping for is some kind of surrender and some kind of awareness that you have a project and it's you. Made a list of all persons we have harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. More part of the letting go of shame, like this is what I can do. Sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's paying people back. So much of what goes on with self-medicating behaviors for all of us, whether it's workaholism or alcoholism, or codependency, as many of us struggle from, it is trying to get rid of the shame and the guilt, trying to medicate that, trying to get that to go down. These steps, 6, 7, 8, 9, and even 10, these steps try to get rid of it by working through it. I had a student who committed a hit and run before he came to the program, and part of his own recovery that he had decided was he was going to turn himself into the police department, which he did. They couldn't find any record on the dates that he supplied for them, but he was willing at one point to take whatever the consequences. He didn't know what the victim had suffered, and he was drunk at the time, but he was willing to go to that level to get rid of it. Being willing to accept consequences, not feeling impatient, right? With others. I think one of the great measures of accountability is that you're patient with, you let the other person move through forgiveness and trust on their terms. Let me say that again, because I think it's so important for parents. I think one of the markers of accountability is that you're willing to let the others that you've hurt move through forgiveness and trust at their pace, not yours. And I hope that empowers you with your children as they move through this process and when they get impatient with you. When they talk about, you don't trust me. You need to trust me. Now, right? You need to move on. When they start dictating to you what you need to do, I think they're out of accountability at that moment. And so for all of us, we give it over to the other person, right? And when somebody starts demanding the pace, the way that we move through our own grief process, our own anger, our own hurt, our own trust, our own wounds, they're practicing in an area that's not their business. They're not on their side of the street. And this happens in our program all the time. This happens in our standing groups. This happens. The group microcosm becomes an example of the family, and we practice it here all the time. And they get better at it. Then they practice it in the small little circle, the small little box. Then they practice it more with you, and then eventually they move on to the next setting, whatever that is, and on into the rest of the world, the rest of their life. Continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. I was talking to a client recently, like, how great would it be if parents did this every day? This is a daily inventory. In some of our groups, we do this every day. We have a 10th step group where we talk about, here's what I did today, here's the resentments that I held on to, here's the dishonesty, here's the unkindness, this is the amends that I need to make. I've told this story before when my mother, a couple of times in her old age, and my mother is, she's in her late 70s now. In the last 7-8 years, my mother several times, not from a guilty place, not from a self-flagellating place, but she's come to me and she said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for this in your childhood. I'm sorry for this and the way I treated you. And it was a simple, and it was wonderful. You know, and so I think this is what we're asking your children to do, is to learn to say they're sorry, to have enough confidence, to get rid of enough shame that they can say them sorry. I mean, this is really the test, isn't it? Is if you can look at yourself, your flaws, your mistakes, without expecting it from, you're not asking for something from another. See, accountability and making amends doesn't ask for something from the other. It is in itself a gift. There are no strings attached to it. One of the difficulties that we parents have in this moral inventory, in this constant process, is we're afraid that our children are going to use this against us. Well, guess what? They can't if you don't let them. Because if I don't need anything from you and you use it against me, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect me. That's not why I was doing it. I might even have empathy why you're using it against me, because I understand how I hurt you. It's the process of living accountability in our lives. It's recognizing the journey instead of the destination, right? You will never arrive. I will never arrive. It's letting go of the outcome, like we've talked about, air phase. You know, I've talked about this idea that we didn't design a program specifically where most of our clients, most of our students would graduate with air phase, that final phase, because we wanted them, for many of them, to recognize there's still work to be done. And the few that have graduated on earth phase, I find that more of a burden than a blessing. Many of them are challenged when they reach air phase with the idea like, I am done. They move on to the next program and they say, I did all the work that I needed to do at Evoke. I can go home now, right? Instead of saying, gosh, I'd rather be home, but there's still work to do. Sometimes we move them up and down in levels to remind them of the journey, to help them see. And again, it's not a shameful process. It's just, you're not there yet. That's not where you are. And we can move you back up. To understand the regressions and the lessons that come from it. You know, regression is inevitable for all of us. It doesn't abdicate our responsibility. right? Doesn't give us permission or invite us to do it. It's just recognizing that we're going to make mistakes, and there's going to be moments where we're more enlightened. There's going to be moments where we're more regressed than others. And if I acknowledge that, then I can learn from it. If I'm defensive of that, that need not be the case, then I'm going to have a hard time being open to the lesson. And then in the next step, they continue. In the next step, they continue this process, but we just hopefully get them on the path here. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will and the power to carry it out. There's so much in this language that is that sounds like traditional organized religion. And I think that's one of the barriers for many people. But again, this is about mindfulness. This is about asking for help. This is about surrendering. This is about recognizing that you need some guidance in the process. And a lot of people, I talk to a lot of my friends are in long-term recovery. And they'll say to me all the time, like, my recovery doesn't look like the guys sitting next to me recovery. They get to that place where they have their own version of recovery, and it works for them. And I think for parents, for anybody, I think that can be true. Like, this is my work. This is how I do it. But when we stumble over the differences, over the details, and we miss the big picture, when the tree gets in the way of us seeing the forest, I think is when we struggle. And I've said this many times. The more we work in therapy, the more any of us work in therapy, the more that we grow, the more similarities we see between ourselves and others, the fewer differences that we see. So many parents say, well, my child's not an addict. Or so many of our children say, but I'm not an addict. Or my child has Asperger's. Or my child's a young adult. Or my child's 8 years old. Or my child's 15 years old. Right? There's all these ways that they're different. Yes, there are differences. But we are more alike than we are different. And when people get to that place, I see it all the time in the groups. They say, I don't have a drug problem, but I have an anger problem. My problem isn't alcohol, but when I'm hurting, I use cutting or avoidance or yelling or control or eating or restricting or whatever it is. So that's kind of a big preamble to this bullet pointed list that we can see the similarities. Wellness therapy gives them space. Like I said, it practices silence. It gets us quiet, gets us in touch with our highest self, with the divine in us, the divine that connects all of us. All right. Earth phase is that beginning quieting time. Solo is kind of the exaggerated piece of wilderness. Right. Not enough of us. Have you guys seen that Louis C.K. bit that he did on? I think it was I don't know if it was Jimmy Fallon or if it was on Conan O'Brien, but he talks about that empty side, that lonely side inside of all of us, that these things over here, that these things cover up. We don't sit in silence enough. We don't meditate or sit quietly. We don't spend enough alone time thinking and feeling. One of the things that people ask us is like, can our children have books? The child asks, can I have books? Even good books. And our response is, sometimes we want them to be quiet. Even good books. Sometimes, even on solo, we don't want them to be reading. We want them to get in touch with themselves. Meditation can be a part of it. Understand the difference between being and doing, right? Like, who are you if you're not doing? One of my medicators is work. I love my job. I enjoy it phenomenally, passionately. But can I be okay when I'm not doing that? Can I just sit and be quiet? Can I, as my therapist often suggests to me, just sit and watch the paint dry? Can I do that? Finding yourself, your voice, who you are, besides what you do. And like I said, you can have religious texts out here, and that can be a part of it. We're not going to be the agent for the parents to get your children to believe what you believe. We're not going to do that. But we're going to give them the space. We're going to remove all the noise that gets in the way of them considering it. We're going to get them healthy so they can make a choice. And many times they come back to the religion of the family of origin, and sometimes they don't. But the best way we know to do that is to treat the mental health and addiction issues and then let them figure it out. The 12th and final step, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. In our program, we do it through mentoring. We have mentor parents. That was a program we instituted 12 years ago. service is a big piece. You know, I'm not doing service for free when I'm doing this right now, but I try to do pro bono work and I try to help people. And frankly, I get to do a job where I'm reminded of the principles that I need to live every day. So while it's not service, it reminds me doing and helping others helps us to invest more in the principles, helps us to get beyond ourselves. So service is a huge component. I can't imagine, no matter what the child or parent's issue is, where service is not a fantastic contribution to their overall mental and spiritual health. I can't imagine it. And for many addicts and alcoholics or people in recovery from codependency and family issues, family trauma issues, that's why we invite you all to go to 12-step programs. You helping other people. I have people on this list that I'm looking at, and I know you help other people. And I know that's a part of your recovery. That's why the length of stay, going beyond the rush, beyond the newness, beyond the change is important, because they can help other people in the program. And going on to the next step and extrapolating the lessons, right? Taking this small little universe that you were living in and learning to apply it to the larger universe, living one day at a time. I've told the story when a young client asked me, one of my first clients in wellness therapy asked me after I asked her, how do you do it? She dealt with severe abuse. And she was working through it. I said, I was just overwhelmed with the grief and the pain and the severity of it. I said, how do you do it? And she just said, how do you do it? And I remember thinking, well, that's a really good, disarming question. And I remember thinking, one day at a time. It was the first time I realized, one day at a time. Swimming fast and transferring to the race. Swimming fast, there's this, when I was doing Ironman triathlons, the coach gave us, you know, when I go to master swimming classes, they ask you to swim with fins because there are certain exercises that they're doing. You know, there's certain muscles, certain exercises that work. But one of the things that I love that my coach says, he said, I want you to know what it feels like to swim fast. I want you to know what it feels like for the water to rush over you in a certain way. And then when you take those off, when you take your fins off and you swim, I want you to remember that. And I think we teach your children what it's like to swim fast. We want them to feel like what it's like to swim fast. I will admit, wellness therapy is like having fins in the water. And when we take those fins off, they're not going to swim as fast. They're going to struggle. It's going to be difficult for them. But they will have had that reference point about what it feels like to swim fast. The general principles of the 12-step, control and transcendence, learning to transcend, right? Learning to overcome, learning to deal with what is given to you, learning to feel through it, and learning to make choices. Learning to live one day at a time. That's why we have no future information here, right? That's why we remove that future information, so we focus on the here and now. Future information can be a distraction from feeling. In regular life, it's okay. But we can also get obsessed with it in regular life. Right? We can lose track of the now and of what we're feeling. Surrender and humility. It's core all through all the 12 steps, as I've just discussed. It invites, when you admit that you're an alcoholic, or you admit that you're a codependent, or you admit that you're addicted to shame, or whatever it is, that you're depressed, that you're anxious, that you have Asperger's, NLD, whatever it is, when you admit that to yourself, when you can be honest with yourself about that, you also inherit with that admission a certain protocol, certain things that might be helpful for you. If you admit to yourself that you're bipolar, you recognize that you're going to need medication, right? If you recognize that you're an alcoholic, that you're powerless over alcohol, you can't take a drink anymore. If you recognize that you're codependent, you're going to have to practice healthy self-care, and you're going to have to battle to set healthy boundaries in your life with others. On and on and on. One of the things that the 12-step does also is it offers you culture, right? A group, a sense of belonging, right? So when you go to those codependent anonymous groups, those family anonymous groups, those alcoholics anonymous groups, those Al-Anon groups, whatever they are, there's other people that let you know you're not alone. They can relate to you. They can help. You can lean on them. You can hear from their strength, experience, and hope, and you can borrow that, because you have very little of that in the beginning. And then when you get some of it, you share your experience, strength, and hope with them. It's a group dynamic. It's not the family, but it's a place where you go to get a sense of what it feels like to belong. And doesn't keep you stuck or low. People that are in recovery that I know are constantly growing and open and expanding and learning. It teaches interdependence, and that comes in with the group support, right? That I can't do this on my own, and sometimes we think we have to. And sometimes that's where we are stuck and get stuck. Learning to show up. I always talk about, that moment when you walk in and you say, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a codependent, well, I'm whatever. It's not keeping yourself low with this label. It's just saying, this is what I struggle with. This is my predisposition. And everybody else in the group saying, welcome. When you announce in these meetings, hi, my name is Brad, I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is Brad, I'm codependent. Hi, my name is Brad, I'm an alcoholic. And people say, hi, Brad, all in unison. What they're saying is, you're welcome. You're welcome here. You're welcome to sit down here. And like I talked about the other night, empathic treatment without judgment. I was talking with a reporter just this week about the way that the Surgeon General and the President are talking about addiction. And in Canada, they're talking about this. And this is sweeping the world. We're starting to change from the 1980s and 90s, where it was the war against drugs. We treated it as a crime, to understanding addiction and the disease and having that empathic, compassionate response to it. Because when we treat it that way, we don't contribute to the shame that is underlying most addictive, unhealthy behaviors. So my conclusion is the 12 steps aren't about drugs and alcohol. They're about life. They're about these principles. They're about living. They're about learning how to live in the world with a new kind of sensibility, a new way of being. Happy to deal with any questions that anybody has about this. Our son was 17 when transported in winter to Wilderness. This was his third and last involuntary transport, and it caught him completely off guard. Home now after 9 months, a family friend came to visit him recently, and he was already in bed, and our son waited at the door with a baseball bat, fearing he might be transported again. He is now 18. Other than listening to his experience, would there be anything else we could do to assess the degrees of trauma these transports had on him? Well, he obviously needs therapy around it. I'm not sure that. Yeah, I don't know. Listening, getting him help, getting him to work through it. If he were my client, I would say the best way to prevent a baseball bat is not the way to prevent transport, right? That's like it's like seeing a police officer when you or I are driving on the street. The best way to not have a fear reaction when you see a police officer is to be obeying the law. And so part of me says, more than anything, he needs to work through it. If there are trauma triggers, if it happened in a traumatic way, my experience is that people talk about it traumatically, that it's something else. So that's a tough one. Again, responding with a baseball bat, having a baseball bat by your bed, isn't evidence of trauma. It's an evidence of an inappropriate way of coping with something, right? If I was traumatized by the transport, I wouldn't have a gun by my bed to stop it from happening, in other words. So I think there's some other anger issues going on here, some emotional regulation going on here, some issues around violence that are separate from the trauma response. So therapy, listening, and then not letting him beat you up with it by just letting it wash through you, letting it go through you. That would be my response. I don't think the baseball bat is evidence of trauma. I think it's evidence of another problem. Our son said your son's LOA, you said your son's LOA was yours now and you could share with other people. Isn't that a breach of confidentiality contrary to the spirit of this step? In the 12 steps, yeah, it is. What I meant by that was there were things in that letter that involved people in my neighborhood that I wasn't comfortable keeping that secret, right? I didn't make an agreement. Like if I was his priest or his sponsor or his therapist, I would keep it confident. Absolutely. I would, if I was his sponsor in AA, I would keep it in confidence. But as his father, when he says, I stole X, Y, and Z with my next door neighbor, or remember that time that the house was broken into, that was me. I now can do with that what I want. I made no agreement of confidentiality. Yes, as a therapist, I do, and yes, as a if I'm an ecclesiastical leader, I do, or if I'm a sponsor, that I do. But I don't make that agreement as a parent in this example. And there were some things I don't even know what I did. I didn't do much with it, but more importantly, it was him starting to dictate a line of expectations about what I could or couldn't do, even could or couldn't feel. He said, I don't want you to hold it against me. And he meant emotionally. He meant that he didn't want me to have rules or boundaries in place as a result of what I was now becoming aware of. I wasn't willing to agree to that. Is there anything a parent can do if all the professionals say your child is not an addict, but your child is addicted to being an addict and addicted to AA meetings because it gives her a false sense of belonging and blocks her from her personal growth and self-worth? I don't know that I would say that I've encountered that ever. I don't know. See, being an addict is none of, whether you think you're an addict or not, is none of my business. It's not my business. Again, do I have a right from the state of Utah to diagnose you with substance abuse disorder according to the licensing division in Utah? I do have that right as a therapist. But whether or not you're an addict is not my business. And so professionals and you thinking your child is an addict or not your business. Simple. If she thinks she's an addict, she gets to say that. And if she, being addicted to AA is would be self-treating. AA teaches you balance, teaches you openness, teaches you not to be rigid, right? Not that the people there are that they're not rigid, they are, but that's because they're addicts and alcoholics. But if you embrace the concepts of this, you become less rigid, you become more balanced, you become more open, you become more humble, so forth and so on. How do you become a parent mentor? At the end of your program, you fill out paperwork that says that you are willing to be one, and then we call you and ask you. You could talk to the parent coordinator about that. Then there's a little bit of training, like a couple of pages that you read, where you are also there to help people go through their first couple of weeks. Do some hand holding during the difficult first couple of weeks of emotional stuff. Michael might be getting another question up for me. Okay. I'll get that one at the end, the last question at the end. The play is upcoming in October. You want to come to the opening night gala and the breakfast with the Evoke people? We'd love to have you. Go to onguardarts.org to find out all about it. It starts in New York City. Be a wonderful visit for you. Love to see you there. We'll have about 12 of us Evoke people there, also at the breakfast the following morning. Here are the upcoming workshops. Finding You in Park City. Coming up, Heroic Journeys is for families. Finding You in Park City, this for individuals. The Entrada workshops. The workshops are psychoeducational, large groups, experiential. The programs on the right are elective. We want all parents to go to the programs on the left who possibly can. On the right, if you want to do deeper work with me, I run these, and you can come to these, work on yourself in the Finding You one, or if you want to bring several family members, then you come to the Heroic Journeys one. The Heroic Journeys one in October is going to be out in the wilderness at our Oasis program. We want all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Just try them out. Just feel them out. See what they're like. They're free. Not very many things are free in this work. And not all groups are created equal. So you might find an Al-Anon group that you like better than a Coda group. You might like the culture of the Families Anonymous. When you go there, ask other people what groups they like. And if nothing else, I always say this, if nothing else, walking into these rooms, as uncomfortable as it is, gives you some empathy for what your child is being asked to do by walking into our program, to our groups, and share his or her self with complete strangers. Parent support groups coming up, New York City. We also have, coming up a little bit later, we have one scheduled in Atlanta and back in Toronto later in November, December, so I'll put those on here soon. New York City, September 14th, Los Angeles, this is in the afternoon again. Potluck in the afternoon. We're doing it in the afternoon on a Sunday so that traffic is low. It makes it easier for people to get there earlier and just making it all around better. Bay Area will be the following day on the 19th, 6:30 to 8:30. Look forward to seeing you all folks there. Follow us on social media. You can get announcements, inspirational quotes, and ideas there. For those of you that sometimes either things go to spam or you don't get them when we send out e-blasts for announcements or invitations, follow us there, and you can get some of those things that way. Go to the blog to find out stuff. I wrote one. We were focusing on Suicide Prevention Week this week. I just published one on what if my child is suicidal. Here are the Pursuits program. This is fun adventure for families or for young adults. Therapy light, very light, more about adventure and self-esteem. The book is available on Amazon for audio purchase or for Kindle or paperback. Go to the Foundation, Parent Alumni Foundation page. 10% of your purchase goes to help people who can't afford treatment, and it costs the same place as going to the regular Amazon. All right. Any other questions that are off topic? As parents, we are told to let go of a child. Let go of a child. Let go and let God. My son called from his new boarding school stating he hates his roommate who is 14 from Germany and is a junior. My son is 18, senior. My son said, you have to get this changed. I agree with him. This is concerning, especially since he said if this kid does not stop bothering him, he will kill him. We're just 10 days into the school and he just left RTC. How do I let go of this? You don't. Letting go of it means that you are authentic, honest, and straightforward. It means that you can't control your child how he feels. You can't control how he turns out. What you can control is, I'll give you another example. You can't control whether your child feels loved. You can't. It's impossible. But you can control whether you love your child. You cannot control whether somebody trusts you, but you can control being honest. You can't control whether your child is happy, but you can control whether you are kind and compassionate towards him. So letting go is not caring, not worrying, not feeling. It is focusing on what you can control. So in this, you can do what you think is right. Right? You can do what you feel good about. You can be honest. You can advocate for him in whatever it is. You can do whatever, but you can't control how it turns out. Right? That's what letting go is. Letting go is learning to trust your swing in tennis, but not try to aim the ball. Right? Letting go as an actor, I'm sure, I'm not an actor, but getting up on stage and giving it the best performance you can. But you can't control whether people applaud. And I could go on and on and on. You can't control whether you get a raise at work. You can control whether you work hard, whether you show up on time, whether you develop skills, right? I used to ask this question, who's in charge of you getting a raise at work, you or your boss? Most parents say, well, you are. And that's not true. You could have a stupid boss, a dishonest boss, a company that doesn't have money to give you a raise. I can think of 100 reasons why you can't control that. But you can control showing up on time, working hard, being creative, learning the skills that the job asks for. You can control all of that. And then you can quit the job if you want. But you can't control whether your boss gives you a raise. But we as parents, we as people get so lost that we think we can control other people. So you can't control your son in this situation. You can just control how you participate in it. And that's a very different process. Hope that's helpful, makes sense. All right. Next week, I'm going to talk about meta-communication and 12 things not to say to your children. I really didn't know if it was going to be 12 or not because I haven't written this yet, but I just put 12 up there. So it might be 10, it might be 15. So that'll be next Wednesday, the 14th. I'll be running the Finding You. So it'll be next Wednesday, the 14th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Meta-communication and 12 things not to say to your children. Have a great week. Hope this was a helpful point of contact with you. And I will talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.